73. According to the CDC, that's how many Americans die by suicide each year. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. And of those 42,773 people, 1,100 are college students, like you or like me. Suicide is something that has affected our campus, that has affected each of us personally. And that's because suicide doesn't just affect the person's family or the friends, it affects the community. And we want to look at how we can better help prevent suicide and make our community stronger. Today, let's talk about preventing suicide and saving lives in the context of trauma treatment. My name is Kathryn DeWitt, and I'm a research assistant at the Center for Mental Health Policy and Services Research. I first became involved in mental health activism through Active Minds, a national nonprofit focused on changing the conversation about mental health. I knew I wanted to get involved in a more academic sense, and I was able to do so through the center, where I performed lit reviews, worked with databases, and worked with cutting-edge science, implementation science. I want to give you an outline of where we're going today. I see my talk as an hourglass because we're going to start off very broadly in mental health. I'll give you some terms that will guide our discussion. Then we're going to get a little bit smaller into the context of community mental health, specifically who is being served there, why it matters, and how that affects the trauma treatment that we're implementing in community mental health centers. I see my research as the smallest element right there. It is the subset of people who are receiving this trauma treatment in the subset of community mental health. We're going to start to broaden out again and talk about the methodology that I used to select participants as either suicidal or not suicidal. And from there, we'll be able to broaden again to see the results, looking at the outcomes of the youth who are tagged either as suicidal or not suicidal. From there, we'll get once again broader and look at implications, not just for community mental health centers, but also for people who are suicidal in the world. Throughout this presentation, my goal is to prove to you that suicidal recipients of trauma treatment are a distinct population from those who are not suicidal. I want to give you a couple definitions to frame our discussion. The first definition that I want to give you is trauma. Trauma is an emotional response to an event. It is not that event. Depending on genetic factors, your cognitive thinking style, and your social environment, you'll react to trauma differently. What may be traumatic for me may not be traumatic for you. Trauma manifests both physically and emotionally. The next definition that I want to give you is the specific type of trauma treatment that we're looking at, which is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, more commonly known as TFCBT. Cognitive behavioral therapy was designed by Aaron Beck in the 1960s, here at the University of Pennsylvania. He was able to revolutionize behavioral health because he noticed that your thoughts influence your feelings, and those feelings influence your behaviors. Those behaviors influence your thoughts, once again, and we're back at the beginning. By changing maladaptive thinking styles, we can elevate mood and curb bad coping mechanisms. Through this mechanism, we've been able to revolutionize behavioral health. The final definition that I want to give to you is suicidality. For the purposes of my study, anyone who talked about suicide, who had previously attempted suicide, or who had self-harm was classified as suicidal. Now that we've gotten these definitions to guide our discussion, let's look at the context of community mental health. What makes it different from CAPS or from a private clinician? Community mental health centers serve people who have little to no insurance or who have Medicaid. This is a high-risk, very vulnerable population that doesn't have as many resources invested in them. And that's why this research is so important. There are other elements that also impact people's abilities to access treatment based on who they are, but also elements that impact clinicians' ability to give the best possible treatment. We're going to look at these two elements as we continue. First, let's look at client level. Who are the people being served by community mental health centers, and what factors impact their ability to get treatment and to continue to show up at treatment. The first of which is transportation. Community mental health centers are not in everyone's backyard. So you may have to go 20 to 30 minutes to get to your local community mental health center. And that may or may not be an option depending on where you work. If you're working 9 to 5 and that's the job that you need to keep your apartment or to keep food on the table, taking an hour out of your job to get the treatment that you need might not be an option. Also, if your job has you take shifts maybe the day of, you might have to no-show for an appointment that you've had for the past week. Another element that we need to think about is childcare. If you're a single mother and you're trying to get treatment, are you going to take your 5-year-old child to a community mental health center? Or if you're getting treatment for one of your kids, do you take their siblings to that community mental health center as well? The final element that I want to bring up is stigma. We've had a lot of talk about stigma on campus, but for some cultures and communities, stigma is even greater. Some cultures and communities see mental health not as a valid concern, but as a weakness. And for people who come from those backgrounds, even getting in the door is an accomplishment. And getting treatment on a week-to-week basis is an achievement. If we can go against all these different factors that are holding our client population back from getting the treatment that they so desperately need, we should be able to provide them the best treatment that they can possibly get. The next element that I want to talk about are some of the clinician-level factors that affect clinicians' abilities to give the best care possible. Specifically, I'm saying that there are elements that prevent community mental health clinicians from doing their best job. I'm not saying that community mental health clinicians are worse than private therapists. Rather, there are factors that create the perfect storm that prevent them from doing their optimal job. And specifically, I want to talk about 4. The first is the contractor model. Clinicians are being paid based on the number of clients they're seeing. If a clinician had scheduled 4 different appointments, but 3 of the clients no-showed for the reasons that I talked about previously, they would only be paid for 1 of them. That leaves a higher level of financial strain. Working in the health and human services already means that these therapists are not paid that much. But if your pay is variable based on whether people are showing up or not, that is a higher burden that can lead to stress levels and specifically lead to greater levels of burnout. Burnout can result in depersonalization, which is incredibly difficult because if a therapist is depersonalizing, not seeing the person that they're seeing for therapy as human, they cannot effectively do their job. Additionally, therapists who have higher levels of burnout will have decreased personal accomplishment and be less likely to continue to want to do what they are doing. And that leads to turnover. Nationally, we see 60% of the community mental health centers have turnover. That's saying 60% of their workforce leave. A huge part of getting therapy is having that therapeutic relationship with someone that you can trust, someone that you can open up to. And in community mental health centers, if we're seeing these therapists turn over at such a high rate, how can we see lasting change? How can we see an environment where someone will be able to trust their therapist? Now that we've talked a little bit about the context of community mental health and how it is more difficult to implement changes and how it's harder for people to get the treatment that they so desperately need, let's look at the trauma treatment within this context. So I mentioned the words implementation science before, but what exactly is implementation science? Implementation science is the study of getting research into practice. We are a research institution. There are thousands of innovations that are going on here at Penn, but we want to see them into the community. And implementation science studies how to get innovation into the use in the community while maintaining fidelity, or the truthfulness to that innovation, but also doing it more efficiently. Right now, the research practice gap is 17 years. It takes a whole generation to get that innovation into the community. The goal of implementation science is to shorten that time and get innovations into the community quickly. Specifically looking at the trauma treatment, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, we're using a project called the Philadelphia Alliance for Child Trauma Services. and implementing trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. We're doing that by providing trainings for therapists, which they wouldn't get otherwise. As contractors, they're not paid to skip the training that they need. We're also providing supervision, which contractors also do not get. Finally, we're measuring the outcomes and the benefits of the trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy by conducting interviews with the youth. So now we've talked about the trauma treatment in the context of community mental health center, and we're finally getting into that subset that I'm most interested in, suicidality and trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. But why would we care about this? Is this just some random thing that Kathryn's interested in? I would argue that it's not. And I want to give you two quick little stories about why I think it matters more before I give you some numbers. The first is that childhood sexual abuse is correlated with suicide. As the person who primarily enters the data for this project, I noticed that most youth reported that their primary trauma was some childhood sexual abuse. But that's not enough to start a research project. The next thing is an anecdote that I want to tell you. So I mentioned that we do measure the outcomes for the youth. And we do that by sending in a graduate student to talk to the youth one-on-one about their symptomology. That's not me, because I'm not a grad student, but I got to hear the story secondhand. Let's say it was a beautiful day, and we had a child go in to talk to our interviewer. They were going through our 4 different measures. How is your depression? Have you been anxious lately? Et cetera, et cetera. At one point, the youth disclosed that he was suicidal. Our interviewer didn't know what to do. Our interviewer is not a licensed clinician yet. Our interviewer is in training to be a licensed clinician, but not quite yet. The interviewer ended up calling our licensed clinician and talking through some of the options. In the end, the interviewer and the child went through and created a safety plan, which is an evidence-based practice to prevent suicide. It lists coping skills, warning signs, and people that you can call if you become suicidal. However, in a follow-up meeting with the therapist, with the child's therapist, the interviewer, and the licensed clinician, when asked if the therapist knew any evidence-based practice to prevent suicide, the therapist replied, yes, of course I do. Whenever the child becomes suicidal, I have them snap a band. That is not evidence-based. That is not how we prevent suicide. So how do we prevent suicide? Okay, I think I've proven to you that we have some reason to look into this. Let's look at the methodology of who we flag as suicidal and who we don't. I want to give you 2 caveats about this research before I continue. The first of which is that we conduct 3 different interviews. The first interview is at baseline, maybe 2 to 3 sessions into trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. The second interview is 6 months in, and depending on the course of treatment and how long, if the participant has been no-showing a lot, that can be 3/4 or halfway through treatment. Finally, we conduct an interview at termination, which is when treatment has subsided. The other caveat that I want to note is that participants who are 11 and older report on their own trauma symptoms. But if a participant is 10 and younger, they have their parent report on their trauma symptoms. So what are the numbers? At baseline, we're seeing 12 out of 57 youth report some form of suicidality. 12 out of 57 youth 11 and older are reporting some form of suicidality. We're also seeing 6 out of 22 youth 10 and under have some form of suicidality. These numbers are staggering. But let's look at the results. First of all, how did I get these results? I used 3 different questions to tag youth as either suicidal or not suicidal. Thinking or talking about death, hurting oneself, or wanting to be killed. Based on the responses to these questions, I tagged a youth as suicidal or not suicidal. Then I was able to evaluate their outcomes based on the 4 different measures that we conduct. Then I aggregated their outcomes as populations. I I aggregated one mean for the people who are suicidal and one mean for the people who are not suicidal. So now that we've talked about the methodology, let's look at some numbers. How are youth who are suicidal in trauma treatment relative to their non-suicidal peers? Okay, we've got a graph. It's going to be okay. First of all, I want to let you know that this is the problem severity scale. We're looking at how severe people's problems are. We're looking here at parents. So this is youth 10 and under whose parents are reporting on their trauma symptoms. For this measure, anything above a score of T equals 25 is clinically significant. That means it should be addressed in therapy, which it is being addressed in therapy. We're seeing also a range of scores. Some are subclinical and some are highly clinical. Now, what happens if we add the element of suicidality? How do our suicidal populations compare to the non-suicidal populations? As you can see here, anyone in orange is someone who is tagged as suicidal based on my classification. And 5 out of the 6 youth, 10 and under, who were tagged as suicidal had clinically significant levels of problem severity. That's starting to indicate something. We're starting to see that these are two different populations that have different levels of problem severity. But let's look at some more data. Now we're going to be looking at the youth who are 11 and older. This is the same measure, the problem severity, and we have a lot more participants here. We have 57. Another thing that you might note about this graph is that we're seeing some spikes that are smaller and some spikes that are much, much higher. I can't really guess as to why that is because there's not a validity measure on this specific measure. We can't tell if somebody is hyper-reporting or under-reporting. Let's add that element of suicidality. Now you can see that in this graph, roughly 11 out of the 12 participants who were flagged as suicidal had clinically significant levels of problem severity. That's huge. Furthermore, this result was statistically significant at a level of p equals 0.02. This was not caused by chance. So we're starting to see that these two populations are distinct, higher levels of clinically significance in the suicidal population. But let's look at one last measure to drive the point home. I aggregated the numbers in this measure very differently. Instead of looking at 57 individuals, as we have been doing, I aggregated the means. So, for example, we'll have one bar that represents the means of the suicidal population, and one bar that represents the means of the non-suicidal population. We'll be looking at 8 different subscales. This is for the child trauma symptom checklist. Now, our orange bars are the suicidal bars. And generally, every single subscale has a higher level in our suicidal population. For this measure specifically, anything above a score of T equals 65 is clinically significant. And we're only seeing one of these subscales which has a clinically significant level, and that is the sexual concerns distress for the suicidal population. There's a huge difference in the two populations, and we're seeing that the suicidal population has more problem severity, has higher levels of anger, depression, anxiety, PTSD, sexual concerns, dissociation. So what does that mean? We've looked at the results. Now let's look at some implications. We have two different populations, and we're seeing that there are clinically significant differences between these two populations. And these results are also statistically significant. These two populations have different levels of clinical significance and different levels of needs. Now, I can't make more generalized statements about whether they'll improve as relative to, the suicidal population will improve relative to the non-suicidal population, because I don't have the data on the follow-up and the termination yet. And when I do have it, I will be able to make statements about whether participants who are suicidal at baseline improve faster or slower relative to their non-suicidal counterparts. But what do these two separate populations mean? And how do we address suicidality in community mental health? I see a couple steps moving forward. The first is adding suicide prevention treatments in conjunction with trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. As I mentioned, safety planning is something that a therapist could do in addition to trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a piece of paper developed by Greg Brown here at the University of Pennsylvania, who was able to create evidence-based ways to prevent suicide by listing coping mechanisms, people you can call, as well as just a place where you could write down your warning symptoms. Another way that we could prevent suicide is if suicidality becomes more acute, switching the treatment modality. Instead of using TFCBT, the therapist could switch into using cognitive behavioral therapy for suicide prevention. Now, this option is less viable because, as I mentioned, community mental health centers don't always have the types of trainings available if you have a contractor model. And we're already trying to teach these therapists trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. If I had a perfect world and an unlimited amount of money, I would design a community mental health center that had therapists who would be paid full-time. I would design a community mental health center that had therapists who would reflect the population of the community, who could speak Spanish if it was a Spanish neighborhood, and conduct therapy in Spanish. I would have evidence-based practices, not just for suicide prevention, but for every type of disorder. Unfortunately, that's not the case right now. But what steps can we take forward using this research to move towards that ideal? I see three specific future directions. The first is looking at the mechanisms of suicidality. What makes the suicidal mind tick? Why do people want to kill themselves? And how do we better prevent suicide? The second direction is, do clinicians know the evidence-based practices? And as I've mentioned, this is an issue that I personally feel that they don't. How do we assess their knowledge, and how do we teach them in a way that recognizes the context of community mental health? Finally, it would be a shame if we didn't mention parents and guardians. Since trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy is treating youth, we have to acknowledge that parents are a huge part of the support system. And if a child is suicidal and the child comes to their parent, does the parent know what to do? How can the parent be part of the support system and prevent suicide? Overall, all these directions move forward towards creating a Philadelphia that can better prevent suicide, not just in community mental health centers, but for everybody. Because Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love, and we as a community need to stand up together to prevent suicide. Thank you. I'd also like to thank the EST board, Itai, Justin, Guy, and Toshe, Dr. Sue Weber, the Center for Mental Health Policy, Dr. Anand Vidas and Danny Adams, and Active Minds and all of you for coming out tonight. I'm going to open up the floor to questions now. So any questions?
You mentioned that there's a population that was under 10 and under and then parents have to talk to them. Did you find that was accurate and that the parents were accurately assessing kind of their status?
So that's actually a really great question. Not the Ohio trauma severity, the one that I showed, but a couple of our other measures have response levels. So we can see if a parent is being truthful in the way that they're responding. For example, we have a question that says, argues with others. And if a parent answers that their youth never argues with others, that puts up a red flag. Based on the responses to those questions, we can see that, okay, this parent was clearly exaggerating or not talking about their trauma symptoms. So it depends, but generally I've seen that most of the parents are pretty honest.
Liz, you did a great job. It was an amazing presentation. Could you tell us more about your personal future directions for the research?
Yeah, I'd actually love to specifically go into two different directions. First of all, being here and working at the center has made me more interested in implementation science and seeing how systems are at play. It's not just one individual who's suicidal, but it's also who works at the community mental health center. How are the systems impacting that therapist from being able to give the optimal level of care? What's going on at home for that child, and how can that child be better served by the school system or better served by the child welfare agencies. So I'm interested in looking at a systems level approach and a public health approach to suicide prevention, seeing what systems and interventions can be done to see, okay, here's our population. How can we better serve people? How can we identify youth who are suicidal and better serve them? But then I'm also very much interested in the mechanisms of the suicidal mind, which is very clinical and very specific and a very different direction. I personally would love to see one direction in maybe the next PhD years to investigate clinicians' knowledge of evidence-based practices of suicide prevention. Yes.
So you mentioned how the research implementation gap is 17 years as of now. Like, that's pretty astounding. What contributes to that, and what can be specifically done by, say, like, the government to shorten that gap?
That's a great question. I wish I knew the answer, but specifically we see issues with funding and the reporting standards. A lot of the ways that we do research is dependent on getting another grant. So people who are doing this cutting edge research are often writing at the same time, grant writing, or trying to publish because we're in an environment where it's either publish or perish. With that in mind, we also have to think about what the clinical sample was for that intervention. Specifically in behavioral health, the people who come in to make the therapy are whiter and richer than the community that it's being implemented in. So finding those ways that we need to translate, okay, this therapy works for upper white middle class youth. How do we translate it for a Spanish speaking population that's low income? That's part of the 17-year gap. The other elements too is getting the community mental health centers to be interested in implementing these projects. If you're trying to keep your doors open and just trying to give therapy in the first place, it's hard to say, yes, I want to do this new innovation. Yes, I want to be on the cutting edge of science. When really all you're trying to do is, I want to help this child that's in front of me. I want to fill out the paperwork so I get reimbursed. There's a lot of other elements to the answer too, so I'd love to talk about this more afterwards.
Who are the generators of these new practices? Because if I think about like the incentive structure, it's not like the pharmaceutical industry where you could turn a profit on generating a new practice that other clinicians would use. So I'm just sort of wondering how that comes about.
So I kind of think about your answer, I think about your question in a couple different ways. The first of which is we've seen some treatment developers, such as Marshall Linehan, who have very personal narratives about treatment development. She was the developer of dialectical behavioral therapy and actually has borderline personality disorder, which she didn't disclose too much later. But she created DBT as a way to deal with her own suicidality. But we also see people like Edna Foa, who's also here in Penn, who developed prolonged exposure and was able to do that because that's her specific interest. There's a whole field of intervention development, and that's incentivized based on publications and based on grant money too. Yes.
So you're talking about how there are all these, this might be controversial. You're talking about how like there are all these like stalwarts in the field in terms of like people who've created all these different like approaches, like such as Aaron Beck and cognitive behavioral therapy, and then a foe, I think you said. In that sense, do you feel like there's a certain research implementation gap here at Penn itself?
So,
Like I'm not privy to kind of the interaction between the researchers and the actual clinics at Penn. Is there a relationship?
I would argue that Penn is at the cutting edge of implementation science because there's a relationship between treatment developers and community mental health centers. One of the amazing partnerships that the center has is with the Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disability Services. But we also are in contact with treatment developers who want to get these treatments out to the community faster and better. I wouldn't say that there's a research practice gap specifically at Penn, because I see Penn, especially psychiatry, to be very interdisciplinary and collaborative. specifically today, my team had a meeting with the suicide prevention people who, like Dr. Greg Brown, who I mentioned, who created safety planning, is part of the implementation of the suicide prevention grant in Texas and Michigan.
So when you're talking about the implementation, the development to implementation gap, it makes some sense because these interventions are being created in universities by researchers who have access to a certain population, and they have to travel a really long way to get to the community. And you said change and be adapted, and all of these things have to happen. Excuse me. Do you guys do any work with like actual people who are in the community when you're doing either intervention development? Because it seems like that would bring you closer to your goal if you start kind of closer to where the need is. Is there anything like that that you're interested in?
Yeah, I mean, at the center, we just had a community advisory board, which is the first of hopefully many to come, where we brought in community mental health clinicians to talk about what researchers want to do, but also hear ideas about what the community mental health clinicians want out of research. So I think that you're hitting onto something that's really great, because when we talk about community partnerships, it's not just one way. It's not just researchers saying, okay, here's what I want to study. Let me come into your environment and have my little white coat and take assessments of all your youth. It's really a two-way street. It's about saying, okay, community partners, we're here because we want to make treatment better, but what can we do for you as we're here? How can we improve the system for you? Yes.
Since it's an election season, I have to ask, would you have any hopes for how presidential candidates or at the state level, do you have any hopes for what politicians could do to help in some way prevent suicide?
So I think that when we talk about politics and we talk about suicide, it's really difficult because we often only talk about suicide prevention in the context of mass shootings and gun law. And that's something that we do need to talk about, because means restriction is the #1 way to prevent suicide. There's a research lab at Harvard that's demonstrated that states who have tighter gun control laws actually have lower rates of suicide relative to states that have more guns available. I personally think that we need to have presidents who talk about suicide prevention and mental health generally more openly, and not when a tragedy strikes. And that can be something that we talk about too in the context of Ken. Mental health is something we need to be talking about on a daily basis and making it destigmatized. Because as I mentioned, stigma is a huge barrier for getting people who need the treatment into the door. I think politicians have a role to play, but they also have a role to play at the local level. And I see that as the way that we can better work with our local politicians, who we do work with, to make changes for community mental health centers.
So I think that will close the question and answer session. Why don't we give Kathryn